December 19th, 1944. Inside a cold headquarters in Verdun, the Allied High Command faces disaster. The German Ardennes offensive has ripped a massive hole in their front line, threatening to unravel the entire war in the West. Supreme Commander Eisenhower looks at his generals. He needs a counterattack, and he needs it immediately. One man speaks up, General George S. Patton. His Third Army is over 100 miles south, locked in its own vicious battle. Yet he makes an impossible promise. He can attack the German flank with 3 divisions in 48 hours. A reckless boast or a calculated move? This is the story of how that promise was kept, how 133,000 men and 20,000 vehicles were pulled from one battle and hurled into another, 100 miles away, in the worst winter in a generation. The legend credits one man's iron will, but was this a miracle or the result of a hidden, meticulous system of planning that was already in motion? To understand this maneuver, we must first grasp the impossible situation the Third Army was already in. By mid-December 1944, Patton's Third Army wasn't waiting in reserve, it was bleeding. For over a month, its divisions had been locked in a brutal, grinding offensive toward Germany's Saar industrial region. This was not a war of lightning maneuver. It was a vicious, close-quarters fight for every fortified town and concrete pillbox of the Siegfried Line, waged by exhausted men. The Army's logistical artery, stretching hundreds of miles back to the Normandy ports, was stretched to the breaking point. The famous Red Ball Express was long over. Now every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell was a precious commodity. Commanders on the front line were forced to ration. Fuel was measured not in gallons, but in hours of combat. Attacks were postponed not for tactical reasons, but for lack of ammunition. And then came the weather. The worst winter in half a century descended on Europe, turning fields into seas of mud and primitive roads into treacherous ribbons of ice. For Patton, this was more than an inconvenience. The endless, low-hanging clouds grounded the 9th Tactical Air Force, the fighter bombers that served as his aerial artillery and scouts. His army was now fighting blind, pinned down by a determined enemy, an unforgiving landscape, and its own strained supply chain. The Third Army was already fighting the wrong war, in the wrong way, at the very limit of its endurance. It was into this meat grinder of attrition that the first confusing reports began to trickle into Third Army headquarters. Something was happening far to the north, in the supposedly quiet Ardennes sector. At first, they were dismissed as minor enemy probes. No one could imagine they were the first tremors of an earthquake. Those first tremors landed on the desk of Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's G2 intelligence chief, on Saturday, December 16th. While Eisenhower's headquarters was still assessing the reports as local skirmishes, Koch's analysis pointed to a major crisis in the making. He alerted Patton, but then he made another decisive call to Colonel Hal Patterson, the G3, head of Army operations. On their own initiative, with no orders from above, Patterson and his staff began to quietly wargame the unthinkable. They drafted 3 distinct contingency plans for a massive pivot north. For the next 3 days, they worked in a vacuum, identifying units, mapping routes, and calculating the astronomical logistical cost. This was the secret behind Patton's confidence. His promise at Verdun wasn't a reckless boast. It was a calculated move, backed by staff work he knew was already finished. And immediately after that meeting, Patton made a brief, coded call to his headquarters. The machine, secretly assembled over 72 hours, was about to be unleashed. That coded call from Verdun landed at Third Army headquarters in Nancy like a lit fuse. Within minutes, the pre-written orders, products of Colonel Patterson's secret planning, began to fly. This was not a single command, but a synchronized cascade of hundreds of messages, clattering out over teletype machines and whispered down telephone lines by Signal Corps operators working in shifts around the clock. The orders split into three distinct streams. The first went to Major General John Milliken's Third Corps. They were to become the spearhead. Their mission? Disengage from a live enemy, turn 90 degrees, and march 100 miles north. The other two streams went to 12th and 20th Corps, commanded by Generals Eddy and Walker. They received the more perilous, less glorious task to stretch their already battered divisions to the breaking point, sidestepping to cover the enormous 30-mile gap that Third Corps would leave behind. It was a high-risk gamble. A single, well-timed German probe into that thinning line could unravel the entire maneuver before it even began. The pivot started on the night of December 19th. The first units of Third Corps began pulling back from the Saar front under the cover of darkness and falling snow. Immediately, the roads became the critical battlefield. Army engineers and military police had designated three main arteries for the move: a southern route, codenamed Red, a central one, Green, and a northern one, White. They were narrow, often unpaved, and now glazed with ice. On these roads, the 797th Military Police Battalion became the absolute masters of movement. They established a system of relentless, one-way traffic, 24 hours a day. These were the kings of the road, standing at unlit intersections in freezing sleet, with no shelter, armed only with flashlights and sheer force of will. For 48 hours they guided the endless columns, tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, and 2.5-ton trucks, maintaining a strict 60-yard interval between vehicles. A single breakdown, a single driver falling asleep, could cause a catastrophic pileup, strangling the entire artery and dooming the relief of Bastogne. But vehicles did break down. In the sub-zero temperatures, lubricants turned to sludge, engines froze, and steel tracks shattered. This is where another unseen army went to work. Mobile ordnance repair crews, working from wreckers and machine shop trucks, patrolled the routes. They were the operations paramedics, descending on crippled vehicles, working with bare hands on frozen metal to get them moving again. Simultaneously, the Quartermaster Corps performed its own logistical ballet. They didn't just supply the columns, they moved entire supply dumps. Pre-planned caches of fuel, ammunition, and rations were leapfrogged from the old front to new, designated points along the red, green, and white routes, ensuring the 20,000 vehicle armada would not run dry. Far to the north, at the headquarters of the German 5th Panzer Army, the first reports were dismissed. Allied traffic moving south to north? It was insignificant, local repositioning. Their intelligence was clear. Patton was hopelessly entangled in the Saar, hundreds of miles away. But then the reports from their southern reconnaissance units became more urgent. The traffic wasn't local. It was heavy, continuous, and moving with purpose. Then, on December 21st, a brief, fleeting break in the clouds allowed a German reconnaissance plane to get a clear look. The pilot's report was scarcely believable. Not a trickle. 3 massive, distinct columns of armor and transport, crawling north like steel serpents. The German commanders stared at the map. The realization dawned with a cold horror. A fresh American army was about to slam into their exposed southern flank, precisely as their own panzers were running out of fuel just short of the Meuse River. By the evening of December 21st, the logistical miracle was complete. The spearhead of Third Corps, the 4th Armored Division, had arrived in its assembly areas south of Bastogne. They were exhausted, frozen, and battered from the 100-mile journey. The machine had delivered them to the doorstep of the battle. Now they had to kick the door down. But the legend of a flawless, lightning-fast pivot hides a brutal truth. The very speed that delivered the 4th Armored Division to the battlefield was also its greatest weakness. Thrown into combat on December 22nd, immediately after the 100-mile road march, the lead units had no time for rest, maintenance, or proper reconnaissance. The initial attacks were not a clean breakthrough. They were a desperate, piecemeal grind against determined German units dug into frozen villages and icy hills. The miracle on the strategic map was paid for with heavy casualties, as exhausted American tankers bled for every yard of ground. And as the advance threatened to stall just miles from its goal, the clock was ticking for the 10,000 men they were sent to save. Inside the besieged town of Bastogne, the situation was critical. The 101st Airborne was nearly out of ammunition, medical supplies, and hope. Then, late on the afternoon of December 26th, after 4 days of brutal fighting, Colonel Creighton Abrams ordered one final, all-out assault. At 4:50 p.m., near the village of Astonishing, a Sherman tank, Cobra King, led the charge. Firing its machine guns to suppress the last German positions, it crashed through the tree line. Its commander, Lieutenant Charles Bogle, peered out. He saw foxholes. Then he saw the distinctive helmets of American paratroopers. One of them cautiously approached the tank. The physical link was made. At that precise moment, the logistical miracle was complete. The promise made in a cold Verdun headquarters 7 days prior was no longer an order on a map. It was now a living, breathing reality in the frozen Ardennes forest. So we return to the question from that cold Verdun headquarters: a reckless boast or a calculated move? The answer is that it was both. Patton's true genius was not in improvising the plan, but in cultivating a staff that could anticipate a crisis and then trusting them implicitly when it arrived. The Great Wheel North was never about one man's will. It was the ultimate validation of a system powered by thousands of unsung masters of industrial warfare, the planners who saw the danger early, the military police who owned the icy roads, and the mechanics who made the entire machine run. The legend is one of spontaneous genius, but the reality was a victory of the system. The most famous improvisation in the U.S. Army's history was, in the end, not an improvisation at all.